So in this series of videos, we're going to look at chapter 22 in the 15th edition of Ragan, which is kind of adding government and trade to the simplest macro econ model. So in our last lecture of the year, we kind of talked about this idea of desired aggregate expenditure, desired aggregate income, which is this theoretical model that we've been coming up with. We then talked about what equilibrium would look like in this model, where we said, actual GDP or actual national income, or Y, equal to desired aggregate income or desired aggregate expenditure, which we represented with AE. And we talked about what happens when there's changes in equilibrium. So we use this idea of the simple multiplier to talk about if some level of autonomous aggregate expenditure changes, what happens to our equilibrium national income. So what we're going to do today is kind of build on this really simple model of the macroeconomy by introducing kind of two new elements. The first is going to be we're going to reintroduce the government into this model. So the government's going to make purchases as well as tax people. So we're going to talk about the introduction of that to the model and how it might change the model. We're also going to talk about introducing trade into this model, so exports and imports. We're going to talk about how both of these things kind of influence the equilibrium, how it influences the simple multiplier, changes in autonomous aggregate expenditure through that simple multiplier. And we're talking about fiscal policy. So this is just a fancy way of saying changes in government purchases and how that influences the economy. That's going to be really relevant right now because the government is looking to increase their purchases to kind of help combat what's going on with the economy right now. And finally, we're going to talk about how this really simple model we've been dealing with kind of ignores the supply side of things. It's all demand determined. In a sense, what we've been kind of assuming in the background is that firms will be happy to produce more without raising their prices. But the supply curves you've kind of seen in microeconomics were upward sloping in the sense that for the quantity supplied to be higher, we need the price to be higher. So we're going to talk a bit about this demand determined output, and next chapter is basically introducing these variable price levels. Before we go into the government and start talking about the government, I just want to make sure we kind of understand where we're at in the model and what we're kind of adding today. So let's just get a blank sheet open. Hopefully it's blank. Great, so it's blank. So if you remember, we started talking about this theoretical idea of aggregate expenditure. So this is like desired aggregate expenditure. So this is, given these real world constraints, how much expenditure do firms and consumers want to make in our economy? And we had originally talked about how this was, there's kind of four main elements to this expenditure side of GDP. And let's just make a little before symbol here. So this is what we did before. So this is last week, so the model we've learned so far. We had this idea that aggregate expenditure equals C plus I plus G plus NX. And what we did last time is we kind of just got rid of the government and net exports. And we kind of shut those away and kind of assumed that they were equal to zero. So there's like no trade and there's no government. And what we did is we talked about the functional forms of consumption and expenditure. So we really concentrated on these two elements, these first two elements here. So consumption is modeled the following way in our was modeled in the following way in our kind of simplest model. So big C equals little a, so this was the autonomous consumption. And then we had this second term, which was the induced consumption, where B was the marginal propensity to consume and YD was disposable income. And then we assume that investment was just some kind of constant. So it's just a number of some sort. It's like 5 or 30 or 30 billion or whatever number it is. And we talked about different factors that might shift these consumption functions up or down, or change the slope if we change the marginal propensity to consume. So we did the same with investments. So we talked about things like expectations about the future. We talked how interest rates influence these two elements, how wealth influences consumption, and how sales influence investments. So I think those are most of the terms that we talked about, but you should review the notes to make sure you understand all the factors that might influence these first two. So what we're thinking about now is we're trying to reintroduce these government expenditures and net exports. So instead of assuming they're zero, we need to think about their functional forms and what determines whether they go up or down. So that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to really think about the functional form of G and things that influence it, as well as taxes, and net exports. So we're thinking about what determines the level of exports in our country, what determines how much we import into our country, and factors that might shift those exports and imports around, like exchange rates and prices and that kind of thing. So the first thing we're going to start talking about is this government expenditure, or government purchases. So the government's going to purchase some things as well as they're going to tax consumers. So let's get started talking about government expenditure.